the option to leave the meeting. We're going to. All right.
Yeah, I can read it.
If you'll starting.
Dagi donde jive sonanji, rola venci sange grumajo, sange jotan soji jonam. Chanjo Dani Jansuji Dani Yonde Jipe Sonanji Grola Benjil Sanje Majo in the Buddha Dharma and the Sangha. I take refuge in the mountains through the virtue generated by this meditation and practice, our achieving Buddha and benefit of all beings.
So first of all, welcome to everybody. Nice to see faces new and old as well. So in the usual way, we normally start just with about 10 minutes meditation. So I'll start and end that. So if you'd like to get ready, and then we'll have the talk, and then there'll be an opportunity. Then we'll probably have a little bit more sitting, and then there'll be an opportunity for a Q&A just to wrap things up. Okay. So if you'd like to get ready, is there anybody who doesn't know how to meditate? Just check. Everybody's got a practice. Good. All right. So the title of tonight's talk, Great Faith, Great Doubt, and Fierce Determination, or sometimes as it's referred to as Great Courage. These are what are known as the 3 requirements of Zen training. But of course, Zen is just a school of Buddhism. So we could say that these 3 are a requirement really for any Buddhist practice. But I wanted to obviously use these 3 because they are something that's quite central to the teaching of Zen, really as a sort of exploration of these, because particularly the first one, great faith, when it comes to the Zen school, quite a lot of people in the West still tend to sort of think of Zen as not really a religion, you know. In fact, I know some people generally don't think of even Buddhism as a religion. I would argue that it is, and I would certainly argue that Zen Buddhism is a religion as well. And the reason that I say that is that people often think, when they think of faith, they think of it, in a religious sense, and usually they think of it in terms of, some kind of doctrinal or dogma that in which one has to believe in order to call oneself a member of the clan, so to speak. But here, actually, when we're looking at faith, and particularly this great faith, it's more about trust. And trust, like anything else, is something that has to be earned, really. And it's something that we have to use in order to discover whether or not we can trust it. And if you think, for example, when we talk about, trusting a friend, for example, if we trust a friend, it's usually because that person came through for us in some way. We were in need, and they were there. And so we have this, an attitude, and it's really, it's almost an embodied thing. There's something in us that now says, oh yes, okay, you actually are a friend, rather than say just an acquaintance. You actually did come through for me, and that can change us a little bit on a fundamental level, changes how we continue to relate to that person. Well, because people tend to sort of think that in Buddhism that it's not much of a religion, that therefore the Buddha did teach that you have to try things out. There is the famous Kalama Sutra or Sutta in the Pali Canon, and this is when the Buddha happened to be passing through. The Kalamas were a tribe of people in sort of northeastern India, and they were sort of on the guru circuit, really. And in this particular sutta, the Buddha turned up and sort of said, "I've come to teach you the Dharma." The Dharma being, the truth, the Buddha's teaching, and this is a term that, although we use it in Buddhism, isn't exclusive to Buddhism. It actually also appears in Hinduism as well. So the people that he was talking to would understand that this term Dharma just means like a religious truth. And they sort of stopped him and said, well, we had someone in last week who said that he was teaching the Dharma, and now you said, and the week before, we had another bloke in who said he was teaching the Dharma, and they contradicted each other. They weren't teaching the same thing at all. And now you've said that you're going to teach the Dharma, and you started teaching it, but you're saying something different to, the other 2 people. So how do we know whether or not to believe you? A very reasonable question. And the Buddha commended them. He said, Kalamas, you are right to question me. He said, you shouldn't just take things, purely on belief. And he sort of listed this whole long list of what we shouldn't believe. We shouldn't just take as truth, an idea because it's fashionable. We shouldn't just take it because it's tradition. We shouldn't take it because we like the idea of it, or it appeals to me, Oh, I quite like to believe that. Therefore I think it's true, sort of thing. Shouldn't believe it because, you like the person who's telling you. Or because you think he's a great guru or something like that. And he goes through this sort of long list of why, why we shouldn't just take things on trust. And then he says, when you have tried these things for yourself, when you've tried out what I tell you for yourself, and you have found out that yes, they work, yes, they lead away from suffering and they lead towards peace at heart, then you know for yourself that these things, will be true. And that is sort of how you tell. And it's a little bit like, in the New Testament where Christ says, you judge a tree by the fruit it bears. It's a very similar, sort of thing. So obviously, when we come into Buddhism, actually, we usually come into it with this sense that, well, we like the idea of it, or perhaps, a friend did tell us, or perhaps, something in Buddhism appeals to us. I mean, again, certainly, I've heard this many times before, where people sort of come in and say, "Oh, yes, the thing I really like about Buddhism is that, for a start, it's not a religion, and secondly, you don't shove things down people's throats and say you have to believe this." And I say, no, that's true. And if they've heard that Kalama story, I quite like the idea that the Buddha said, test this for yourself. And I always sort of quite tempted to say, and have you tested these things for yourself? So no, not really. But I like the idea of Buddhism. That's what I realized. So I said, well, you're still making the same mistake, really, because you're none the wiser if you've not actually tried it out. You need to do something. You need to practice and, see for yourself whether what the Buddha said is true, whether his teachings, do what he says that they will do. You need to find that out for yourself. And of course, once you start doing that, that is when the faith can begin to develop properly. And that certainly begins to change. That certainly begins to change then, how we relate not only to the Buddha Dharma, but also how we relate to ourselves as well. Because Buddhism is about developing the relationship to our own heart, to our own interior. And if we were to sort of ask, okay, here we are in Zen, you said that these were the 3 requirements for Zen training. So that great faith, what is it? What is it that you have to have faith in then? What is it that we have to find out and develop for ourselves? And of course, to begin with, as a great master, Zen master called Master Torre said, he said, the great root of faith, as it's known in the full title, he said, is that all beings, including oneself, has what's called the Buddha nature. And that this Buddha nature can be realized by everybody as well. And this, if you like, particularly when we're looking at the Mahayana development, of which both the Tibetan schools and Zen are all parts of the Mahayana, so they're all sort of on the same hymn sheet, so to speak. This is this realization of Buddhahood. This is why we practice. And again, so I'll talk a little bit about what that Buddha nature is, but also this is something that's sort of very, if you like, marks something out in Buddhism, because certainly the practices in Buddhism, like meditation and mindfulness, as it's called, as well, you can come across these in all sorts of different environments, so to speak, and usually they're attached to health, usually they're attached to well-being, and the science is in, they do make a difference. They can lower your blood pressure, and if you have a tendency towards anxiety, it can help cope with that. And people who are recovering from various things like addiction or depression, etc., it's the data's in, but it certainly helps with that, and that's great. But in Buddhism, that's actually not the core. That's not why we practice meditation. We don't in Buddhism, we don't practice meditation or mindfulness, in order to be healthy per se, or to have less anxiety, though that may well be a side effect. The reason that we practice is actually for wisdom, for 2 things actually. Well, first is wisdom and the cultivation of compassion as well. Because wisdom and compassion, if you like, are the 2 legs on which the whole of Buddhism walks. And the Buddha was very clear about that. And the other thing as well, when it comes to faith, this term, faith, which I said often has a sort of religious ring about it, which, as I said, a lot of people coming into Buddhism may balk at a little bit. And certainly, as I say, when it comes to Zen, because quite often those people who know a little bit about Zen or have read a little bit about Zen Buddhism, maybe sort of thinking, well, my image of the sort of Zen monk is sort of sitting, for long periods, in deep meditation, perhaps on these sort of strange koans, these strange, peculiar questions that are used for developing insight, etc. There doesn't seem to be any need for faith because it's all about your own efforts, really. Isn't that the case? The first patriarch of Zen Bodhidharma said a special transmission outside the teachings, not dependent on words and phrases, directly pointing to the human heart, seeing into its nature and awakening. Well, that's all about the person practicing. There's no God in there. There's no, there's no other power in there at all. So why do you need to have this faith? You just sit, meditation. You just practice Zen meditation, and that's it, surely. But actually, this isn't the case. And if you look at Buddhism in native Buddhist countries, obviously places like sort of Thailand, I'm thinking of, but also in places like Japan, where my own school comes from, you see that there's an awful lot of devotion in it. That when people go to temples, actually there's there's a lot of lighting candles, lighting incense, bowing before the Buddha, bowing before the Bodhisattvas, if you like. Those who aren't familiar with the Bodhisattvas, they're a little bit like sort of either aspects of the Buddha, like his wisdom or compassion, or sometimes a little bit like Buddhist saints. I've heard them called that, and I think that's probably a fairly fair comparison, certainly for some of them. In the same way, these practices appear very much, and they're there also in Zen as well. There's a famous Zen master called Master Gute, who he spent 10 years venerating the Bodhisattva of compassion, or Avalokiteshvara. And the story goes that a Zen nun, after 10 years, sort of happened to walk by. He sort of lived out in a forest, happened to walk by him and saw what he was doing, and went up to him and said, "Can you give me a word of Zen?" Which is basically what she was asking. She was saying, "Tell me your understanding. Tell me have you seen the Buddha nature?" Because, as I've said, this is what this is. Have you seen the nature of your own heart? And he was stumped. He couldn't. And he fell into a sort of real despondency. And then a little bit later, a Zen master walked past, and Gute recognized him. So he asked him this question. He said, "Can you give me a word of Zen?" And the Zen master simply raised a finger like this. And in that moment, Gute had a profound realization, an awakening, and saw into his own nature. And we may sort of think, God, he wasted 10 years, venerating Avalokiteshvara, this bodhisattva of compassion. All he needed was someone just to go like that, and it would have been fine. But actually, that's to miss the point, because without those 10 years of venerating, that ground of his own heart, that ground of his own consciousness, would not have been ready for that. Because look, here I am, I'm raising this finger. Have any of you had a profound awakening? Do be honest, if you have, maybe you have. I don't know. But suffice to say that he was ready at that particular moment. And this shows something about this, the power of this faith, because faith actually is about something beyond myself. If we were going to say, okay, we can have faith in a friend, we could have faith in the Buddha, we could have faith in all sorts of things. But the one thing that all those objects have in common is that they're not me. So it's being able to open up and as it were, to hand myself into something. And it's that handing over, and this is what's called, in Zen, it's what's called other power. There's self-power, which is when one sits down to meditate, one does it through one's own act of will. But other power is when I can't do something for myself. So, when we go to the doctor, for example, because we're unwell, we're putting ourselves into the hands of the doctor, who presumably we trust enough to go to them, and they will then, give us a remedy, which we will then take, because we can't do that for ourselves. And this is why faith is one of the essential requirements for Buddhist practice, because it allows the heart to open up. It stops us being very enclosed. Because if we look at the Buddha's, we go back to the first teachings the Buddha gave, those of you hopefully familiar with the Buddha's Four Noble Truths, the noble truth of suffering, the noble truth of the cause of suffering, the stopping of suffering, and then the path that leads to the stopping of suffering. Well, that second noble truth, the cause of suffering, what did the Buddha say was the cause of suffering? Well, what he said was, and it's sometimes translated a little bit differently, but basically it's that our hearts tend to cling to things. And the one thing that our hearts tends to cling to more than anything else is to the notion of me and myself and I. Now, what do we mean by that? And because also to understand that the Buddha actually said that this me, this I, myself, actually is an illusion, but we can get, it's a delusion. It's what's called a vidya in Sanskrit. Well, what does he actually mean by that? Well, when we talk about a self in Buddhism, we mean something very specific. We mean that something, a self is something that is enclosed within itself. It's apart from everything else. So right now, this is me, and out there is you. And that is how I see myself, and it's also how I see you. And in doing that, there's no necessity for any connection. We could be entirely separate. And it's also a way of seeing as well. If I see myself as apart and separate from you, then I can judge you as well, like you can judge me also. I can see myself as superior to you, or I can see myself as inferior to you. And our self-beliefs that we have always contain something of that. And I can give an example of that, because we don't always necessarily think of ourselves very highly, but even if I think of myself as very lowly, I can be extremely stubborn about it. And I remember many years ago, I used to give regular talks at the Buddhist Society in London on Sunday. And these were known as out-of-town meetings, because there were people who used to come in from usually outside of London, who would come for the whole day, and I would give a couple of talks, and then we'd have some meditation as well, and there'd be an opportunity to ask questions. And so, it was a whole day from sort of 11 to 4. It was quite a regular group of people who used to come, usually about 30 to 40 people would come. And it was quite a sort of, a regular group of people. And there was one old lady who used to come in. She used to live over in towards, I think, Maidenhead, it was. And she used to come in every month. She was very nice, really lovely, very sweet. I gave this talk in the morning about, the Buddha saying that, at the end of the day, that the liberation from suffering is the laying down of myself. That we have to learn to let go of what I want and how I think things ought to be, and to just allow allow the space in the heart to be there without cluttering it up with me and my opinions about it and judgments about everything. And she came up after and she said, "Oh, it makes a lot of sense what you said." She said, "I really, absolutely." And I said, she said, Buddha's teachings were absolutely spot on. She said, "But the problem is that I don't have much of a self. She said, what I really need to do is to build up my sense of self, and then I can lay it down. So then I can hand it over. And I said, what do you mean? She says, oh, well, she says, I always feel that I can't. I always feel that it'll be too much. I always feel that I lack the confidence. I always feel that I don't have any self-esteem, So what I need to do is to build up my self-esteem, and then I can hand this over. So, and I said to her, I said, no, 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 no. I said, who is it that tells you that you can't? Who is it that tells you that it's too much? Who is it that insists you're not up to? Who insists that you have no confidence and that you have low self-esteem? I said, that's I, and that's what needs to be laid down, because that's what she believed about herself. And in that moment, that little old lady vanished, and what was replaced was something very cold, very powerful, and very steely behind the eyes. And she looked at me and she said, but I am rubbish. And you don't argue with that. There was a real power there. There was a real power. These weren't just beliefs, self-beliefs. These were very fired up beliefs. And so when we talk about I, it's this bundle, this complex of opinions about myself that are very fired up with all the emotionality as well. And when it's triggered, you can see it. When it's triggered, it becomes very obvious. And that's how we know those attachments are there, because the emotionality is always triggered when they're crossed or when they're belittled. And this is, if you've ever had the experience, it's what's called the the embarrassing uncle syndrome. Certainly when I was younger, you go home for Christmas. This is when my parents were alive, more members of my family were alive. And there was the one member of the family, and you couldn't stand it because his opinions were the complete contrary to mine. And you promise yourself, I'm not going to say a word. I'm not. And you sit there, and of course, the embarrassing uncle starts up after a few drinks. And you just think, I'm just going to say, I just have to say this one thing. And of course, before you know it, it all sort of gushes out all over the place, and it's a blazing row. It's that sort of thing. But isn't it interesting? Because it becomes unbearable when one of my cherished opinions, my cherished convictions really, is attacked or crossed or belittled or contradicted in some. It feels almost as like a personal attack. And that's because it is. It is a personal attack, because my opinions are me. Those are what I am made up of, those very fired up opinions. And so when it comes to the faith as the cultivation of faith, going beyond I, being able to let go of that and say, it's all right to be able to lay those things down. That is a necessary step in order to go beyond I and to lay that burden down of the attachment to I, which the Buddha said in the Second Noble Truth is the cause of suffering. And that's why faith is important for us. I remember my own late teacher, Venerable Myokyun, who she trained in Japan for 12 years as a lay person, as a laywoman. And she, in a very traditional monastery, Myoshinji in Kyoto. And when she went up to the monastery, as I said in Zen, one of the things that is a regular practice is that you go and have private interviews with the teacher. And this is done during the meditation, and everybody goes and does this. So she had to be shown the form for entering the interview room. So, this was a very traditional, it's a little room. You leave the meditation hall, you come out, you went down the corridor, you would wait in line, and then at the front of the line, there's a bell which you ring, and then you go, and then you slide the door open, and then you have to do a bow to the Buddha, which is sort of, kneeling, the forehead on the floor, and the hands like this. And then you get up, and then you walk to the seat opposite the master, and then you kneel again, you do another prostration, but this time it's like this. And then the interview starts. And when the bell is rung, then the interview's over and you just reverse the process and you leave the room. So at the time, the head monk was this chap called Soko Morinaga. And he had to teach her how to do it. So he got her to do it a few times. And when he was satisfied that she had got it right, he said, okay, he said, that'll do. He said, but I'll tell you something. He said, all you actually really need to do is, he said, at the threshold, when you come in, when you do the prostration to the Buddha, just lay your whole heart down. And then he laughed and said, mind you, he said, it takes about 10 to 15 years to really get it off properly. Myokyoni said, and he was absolutely right. He said that literally was all that there was all that was necessary, because with that laying down of that burden of I, then actually that what lies underneath is a joined upness, what's called samadhi. That's literally what samadhi, it's often translated as oneness, being at one with what at this moment is being done. But it's a joined upness, actually. It's when that sense of being a separate self is no longer there, and there's just that going with the circumstances. And we know this, actually, because if you've ever played a sport or you've ever played a musical instrument, you know you cannot be self-conscious and play it properly at the same time, or you cannot play a game, like tennis or football or whatever. You cannot do that self-consciously. You can't stand apart from it. You have to be in it. You have to be completely in it. And when we talk about samadhi, when we talk about, well, what is called mindfulness practice, but what I like to call daily life practice, this is the giving of myself wholeheartedly into what at this moment is being done. And that requires faith. That requires faith in the ability to be able to do whatever it is. It's rather like coming up here and giving a talk, I can't sit here thinking about what I'm going to say next. I actually don't quite, I know I've got notes here just to sort of more or less keep me on track, but I don't know what the next sentence is actually going to be after this one. And it's fine. I've done this so many times that I have perfect faith that something will come out and it will probably be okay. It's rather like if your phone goes, and you look at it and perhaps it's unknown caller, and you think, oh, I can't take this call because I don't know how to answer the phone to someone that I don't know. Well, you would never think that. You'd just answer it, wouldn't you? Because what's coming next will emerge quite naturally. You have faith in that. In exactly the same way that all of us have faith that we can stand up and walk out of this room, which we will do at the end of it. But put your hand up if you know how that's done. Do you know which muscles you have to move in what order in order to stand up out of your chair and walk out of the room? In fact, even if I don't know if we've got any doctors here, but even if we did have a doctor here, I doubt even a doctor could tell us. And the truth is, we don't need to know, because we have faith in the body that it will happen, that it can happen. So we do have faith already in things. Otherwise, we could not function. We could not function, at all. But we take all these things for granted. We don't even think about them. And that is how great faith works. It just works. But the thing is that because of various self-beliefs, sometimes we hit a wall and we think, oh no, that can't be done. So there's a story of another Zen master called Master Bankei. And he was a very eminent, a very famous Japanese Zen master. And one day an old man came to him and asked to be his student, to be his disciple. Now, this is quite unusual because normally in Zen practice, it's usually younger people who come because the training is very hard. And Bankei says, why do you want to be my student? It's normally, not older people who want to come. And he said, well, as you can see, I am old and, I'm going to be facing death soon. And he said, what I want is the special confidence to be able to face my death, my own death. And Bankei replied to him, he said, there is no special confidence needed to die. He said, when it's time to die, it's sufficient just to die. And I remember hearing that story thinking, God, that's rather callous. You know, that's not exactly, doesn't sound very compassionate. When it's time for you to die, you know, to an old man for whom this death was very real, obviously, and he was genuinely frightened. You know, just to be told, well, when it's time to die, just die. You know, sounds clever, but actually it sounds rather callous. But then, you know, I thought about it a little bit and thought, no, he's absolutely right, because what he's saying to this old man is he said, look, you're frightened of dying and you feel that you have no confidence to be able to face your own death. He said, but right now, you're not actually dying. You're frightened of the idea. You're frightened of the idea of your own death, but you're not actually dying right now. And you needn't worry, because when the moment comes for you to die, a strength and confidence will appear quite naturally, and that will buoy you up, that will carry you through the process of death. In the same way that you had the confidence when you were born. You didn't know, you know, none of us consciously know how to be born, but we did it. None of us consciously know how to grow up or to stand on two legs, but we did it. There was something in us that carried us. And this power, if you like, this wisdom, which is what we call the Buddha nature, is with us all the time. And it'll be with you when you die, and it will carry you into death and what comes beyond as well. So you needn't worry about it. And that's what Bankei was actually telling us. So therefore, he needn't worry about it. So this is this Buddha nature, if you like, this Buddha nature that functions in everything and through all living things. This is what the Buddha nature is, the term we give to the Dharma in living beings, is always with us, is always functioning. And it's in all living things as well. And again, as my own teacher used to like to say, she used to call the Buddha nature the informing information. It's the information that informs all forms. So it informs the cat to chase the mouse. It informs the dog to chase the cat. It informs the snowdrops when to come up in January, February. It informs the cherry blossom to blossom in spring, to fruit in summer, and so on. This is the informing information, and we all have this. And interestingly, in the Parinirvana Sutra, or the Nirvana Sutra as it's called, in the Buddha on his awakening, there are two versions of what he said on his awakening. But in the Mahayana tradition, the Buddha said, how wonderful, how miraculous, all beings, but all beings are fully and completely endowed with the wisdom and the power of the Tathagata, or with the Buddha nature. Tathagata is just another name for Buddha or Buddha nature. But sadly, because of their sticky attachments, human beings are not aware of it. And because of our sticky attachments, including the sticky attachment to I, and because we're not aware of it, we feel a lack of confidence, a lack of purpose, a lack of meaning to what our lives are about. We feel frightened of the world in which we live in because we feel cut off from, and therefore it can feel threatening as well. And this is why then that great faith is important to actually move beyond that. Just keeping an eye on the time. So although there isn't a God in Buddhism, and that is certainly true, that's not to say that there isn't a spiritual power. There is, and this Buddha nature, or in its largest sense, the Dharma, is it. But the difference in Buddhism, say between Buddhism and the theistic religion, is that we don't personalize this power. This power is inherent in everything, and it's understood just to be impersonal. But that doesn't mean that either that we don't, either that it cannot be known, obviously it can be realized, and that is the purpose of our training, is to help us realize that this Buddha nature is functioning all the time as a very real thing, and has very real agency. But also it allows us to have something that we can hand ourselves into, that we can open up to in order to actually realize. And although we don't have a God, it does mean that for those of us who are practitioners, we can, as it were, we can look across to people who do believe in a God and go, okay, I can sort of see how that works now. And I remember I came across a very nice story in a collection. I often collect folk tales and fairy tales. And I came across a very nice one that I think illustrates this quite nicely. And the story is that a king of a certain kingdom, small kingdom, was in the habit in the evening of disguising himself and going out onto the streets to walk amongst the people, to see what they were talking about, to see what was on their minds in disguise. And at one point he found himself in quite a poor area of his city, and people were indoors by this point and they were sort of cooking their dinners. And he walked past a certain house and he heard this man singing a very cheerful, happy song. And he thought, I'm in the poor area now, he said, and here is a man who seems to have no cares or no worries about his situation. I wonder what gives him that. And so he knocked on the door, and the man opened the door and just saw this other, man there. And he pretended to say, can I come in and could you give me something to drink? And he said, I can do better than that. Come and join us with our meal. There's not a lot, but there we are. And we had a family and all this sort of thing. And the king said to the man, he said, you seem to be very happy considering you're quite poor. He said, how come? Most people would be very anxious and very worried about where the next meal is coming from. And he said, I've lived like this for many, many years. And he said, in the end, God has always provided for me. And the king sort of smiled and said, really? You're very poor. Are you sure you could say that God has provided for you? And he said, yes. He says he always does. And the king thought to himself, I'm going to test this. So he goes back to the castle and he calls his chamberlain. And he found from the man that what he did for his living is that he was a cobbler, so he made and repaired shoes. And he said, I'm passing an edict. He said, I'm forbidding the practice of making shoes or repairing them in the city from tomorrow morning. So you go out and you proclaim that. And so he did. The following morning, the town criers all went out and rang the bell and said, new edict from the king, no one shall make shoes, no one shall repair the shoes of another man. And the cobbler suddenly realized he was out of a job. And he did what he always did. He put his hands together and he said, oh Lord, he said, you have always provided for me. He said, the king has taken away my livelihood. He said, what am I to do now? And he opened his eyes, and as he did, he saw a man with a water pitcher, a large jug, carrying water to people working in the fields. And he said, I've got a water pitcher. I could do that. So he went home, got his water pitcher, went to the river, filled it up, and just sold the water to the people working in the fields. He more or less made the same money as he did repairing shoes. So that evening, when the king appeared again in disguise and said, how are you getting on? I always thought of you. He said, how terrible that the king has taken away your livelihood. And he said, well, I prayed to God and I opened my eyes and there in front of me was the answer. He said, I carried water all day. He went back and said, called the chamberlain and said, right, no man may carry water for another from tomorrow. So that went out as well. And the man, when he heard it, thought, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? His hands together, oh Lord, he said, you have always provided for me. What now am I to do? And he opened his eyes and he saw a man carrying firewood. And he thought, I could do that. So he spent the day collecting and selling firewood and made more or less, a good amount of the money that he'd made the previous day. And king visited, he thought, right, I'm going to have to notch this up a little bit and really test him. So that night he went back and he called his head of security and he said, tomorrow I want you to gather together all the people in the city who are selling firewood and bring them to the palace, and you're to make them guards, and you just post them around wherever they can just guard something. He said, and we'll see how that goes. So that following day, all the firewood sellers were rounded up, including our man, and taken to the palace. And they were then suited and booted and, given a ceremonial sword. And they were just sort of parked around various places around the palace and the gates. And at the end of the day, they all trotted back into the head of security and said, okay, we've done the job. Can we have our wages, please? And he said, didn't anyone tell you this is a salaried position? You get paid once a month. You don't get paid daily. And they said, well, how are we going to last the month? We've got families to feed. He said, well, that's not my problem. Our man said, what am I going to do? So he said, oh, Lord, he said, I need to find some money from somewhere to last me until I get my wages at the end of the month. What am I to do? And he opened his eyes and he put his hands down and he felt his ceremonial sword and he thought, I could pawn that, he said. So he took it to the pawnbroker and he got enough money to last himself until the end of the month. Well, that evening, the king appeared again. And they were eating and he was welcomed in. Our friend, come along, come along. And he told the king what he had done. You see, he said, no one knows. He said, well, what are you going to do when you turn up tomorrow? You haven't got a ceremonial sword. He said, I've already thought of that. He said, I've got a couple of bits of wood and I've put some gold paint on. He said, we never use the sword, so it's not like it's just ceremonial. So we just leave it there. King thought, I've got you. So he went back and he called the head jailer who came along and he said, right, he said, who is our worst criminal? He said, oh, we got this terrible murderer. He said, right, we're having an execution tomorrow. And so go and announce it now, 9 o'clock tomorrow. In the town square, there will be an execution. And so 9 o'clock, everybody turned up and there was a big crowd and the poor wretch was sort of dragged out and put down head on the block. And the king called over the execution and said, I don't want you to do it. He said, I want that man to do it, pointing to our man. So he said, go and tell him. So the head executioner went over and he said, right, the king wants you to do the execution. He said, I've never done anything like this before. He said, well, you're going to have to do it now because the king has given an instruction. You must obey. Otherwise, it'll be your head on. So he walked over to the prisoner and he said, as I've never done this before, he said, would you mind if I offered a prayer to God first? And he said, yes. He said, but, get on with it. Hurry up. So he said, O Lord, he said, you who see into the hearts of all men, he said, you know that I have never killed anyone. I've never even harmed anyone. But he said, now my king has instructed me to take the life of this wretch before me. He said, I ask you that if he be guilty, I strike his head off with a single blow. But if he is innocent, may my sword be turned to wood. And he pulled out the sword and everybody gasped and sort of fell back. and the king sort of laughed and called him over. And he said, and as the man came close to the king, he said, do you recognize me? And he said, yes. He said, well, I think you are a very wise man. And I think you would make a very good advisor. So I'm inviting you and your family into the palace and you will live with me from now on. And so that was our story. But I rather like that story because in a way it appears as if somehow, that there's nothing particularly supernatural about it. And yet there is that moment when he reaches a crisis, when his own thinking can go no further. And at that point, his faith comes in. In that case, he offers a prayer. But, it doesn't necessarily have to be a verbal prayer. It can be, and I've certainly done this myself, you sit down, you take a breath, and you just do a little bit of meditation. And I remember, again, my own teacher saying, Yoko saying, someone came to her and said, explained that they have a very particular problem with someone at work. And she said, I really don't know how I'm going to deal with this, how I'm going to carry on coping with this. And she said, she said to this person, she said, well, I could tell you what to do. The problem with that is that when you're in that situation, you'll be so emotionally overwrought, you won't remember a single thing I tell you right now, because you will be, quite so upset. She said, but what you could do, what you perhaps could remember, is that before you go into that situation, she said, go to somewhere where you can be on your own and just 9 times do 9 bows. Put your hands together and just bow 9 times. She said, don't ask what you're bowing to. You're not bowing to anything. You are just bowing, and just bow 9 times. She said, and when you've done that, then go into the situation. And she said, the reason I'm telling you this is because it's a little bit like, the old saying that you can give a man a fish or you can teach him how to fish. She said, I'm teaching you how to deal with an emotionally wrought situation, because in that bowing, you are laying yourself down. The body understands that you are laying yourself down. And there's a space, there's an inner space that will open up. And when that space opens up, when you go into that situation with a little bit less of you in it, the answer will come from the situation. She said the answer will, but it will only appear at that moment. Remember what Bankei said about special confidence. It only appears when you really need it. And I remembered a few years later reading, there's a famous Zen master called Master Rinzai. And he was his teacher, Obaku, had heard of another Zen master who was in another place. And he had his doubts about him. So he called Rinzai and said, I want you to go and test him. And Rinzai said, okay. So he put on his hat and his coat and was walking out of the monastery on the way to this other place. And Obaku shouted after him, saying, when you get there, what will you say? And Rinzai said, when I'm there, the means will become available. And I suddenly understood, but oh yes, that is that. But that requires that great faith. I thought, gosh, if someone had told me to do that, I'd be rehearsing all the way there, thinking, now if he says this, what? But actually, to be able to just hand oneself over into something, that does take considerable practice, and that requires a great deal of faith as well. So that's the great root of faith. The second one then is doubt, which almost seems like the opposite. It's actually called the great ball of doubt. But this is not the same as skeptical doubt. This is not, doubting the Buddha's teachings, obviously. This great ball of doubt is something very specific, and it's something that's very necessary when we're undertaking a spiritual training. And that is that we require a spur. We require a spur to practice. It's not enough to say, well, I'm sort of interested, I have an interest in Buddhism, and I wouldn't mind, practicing it a little bit. Well, we can begin, but it probably won't last. It can be quite a sort of surface thing. We actually need something that cuts a little bit deeper. And you come across this again and again. And if you think about the Buddha's own life story, if you think, for example, early on when he's the prince, yeah, and you remember he takes 4 fateful trips out of the palace, and the first trip he sees an old man, and the second one he sees a sick man, and the third one he sees a corpse or a funeral cortege, and each time he has to ask his charioteer what these are, because he's never been outside the palace before. And Channa explains, they said, oh, this is an old man. And one day, we all get old. You will get old as well. And the people that you love will. And then he sees a sick man and said, and you will fall sick. And the people that you love will fall sick. And then he sees the corpse, and then he said, and you will die. And everybody that you love as well, they will die as well. And these 3 trips out, caused a sort of triggered a sort of catalyzed, if you like, a complete spiritual crisis for Prince Gotham. And it was a result of that. And then he had a 4th trip out where he sees a holy man, a mendicant, sitting in the dust, meditating with a look of serenity upon his face. And the prince, by that point, all he can see is the horror of the world. Everything is going to die. Everything that he loved, including himself, was impermanent, was going to now perish. And he said, how can you sit there when the world is on fire? He said, how can you sit there so serenely? And the man replied, he said, because I search for the deathless. And at that moment, he sort of resolved that I must search for the deathless as well. And that's where he began his spiritual training. But he had that crisis. That for him was the great ball of doubt. That caused him to doubt everything that had gone before, because suddenly all the things that he thought he could rely on, he realized were going to go, that they could not be relied upon. And this is something that's very important when we look at some of the other lives of the Zen masters, for example. They also had this similar sort of crisis. So I mentioned Master Bankei, for example. Well, Master Bankei was a very precocious child, and he was also a very difficult child as well. And he said that I gave my mother absolute hell and my teachers absolute hell. I was never interested in the class. I thought the teachers were stupid. I thought the other pupils were stupid as well. And I got into an awful lot of trouble. And then he said, one day we were learning about the teachings of Confucius, Master Confucius. And the teacher was reading a passage from the writings of Confucius, and he mentioned a term, he mentioned a phrase of Confucius, where Confucius said that what we needed to gain was a thing called bright virtue. I heard this term, bright virtue, and I said to the teacher, what is bright virtue? And he said the teacher, of course, was stupid and couldn't tell me anything. So in the end, he tried to fob me off with some kind of answer, but I wouldn't accept any of the answers that he gave. And in the end, he lost patience with me and he said, oh, you should go and talk to the Buddhists. They know, they do this sort of thing. So I went to the local temple and I said, can you tell me what bright virtue is? And again, they gave me this, tried to fob me off with some answer, but I knew that they didn't know either. And in the end, they said, well, if you really want to know, you better go and ask the Zen lot, because they know this better than us. And so I went and talked to the Zen priest, and all they said was, well, then you better sit Zazen, you better sit meditation, because it's not enough. No one can tell you what bright virtue is. You have to realize it for yourself in your own insight, in your own heart. For that, you need to practice meditation. And he said, this thing bit right into me. He said, I just had to know what this bright virtue was. And so I sat and I sat and I sat, and I made myself thoroughly ill as a result of it. But I refused to give up. And people started coming up to me, my family, saying, oh, stop this, stop this. So I left them, actually went and found myself a cave on a mountain, and I went and sat in the cave, and I just used to sit day, and I used to sit night, I used to sit day, and I got absolutely obsessed by this. And in the end, a doctor was sent for him. The doctor came and looked and said, you carry on like this and you're going to die. You're neglecting yourself. You're going to die. And he said, I developed a terrible sort of pneumonia, and a sort of respiratory illness, and my lungs, obviously began to sort of fill up with fluid, and then they began to bleed. And he said, and if you know the sort of stories of the Zen masters, or even like the Buddha, as you know, the Buddha gained his enlightenment when he saw the morning star after sitting under the tree of enlightenment for 8 days. Well, it was very different for Master Bankei. because what happened is that he had a hacking coughing attack whilst he was sitting meditation, and he spat out a lump of bloody phlegm that hit the wall opposite the way he was sitting. And as it dribbled down the wall, he had a profound spiritual awakening. So it's not always nice. And after that, then he gave up the sitting because he had realized what this bright virtue was. But these stories are many, and it's quite interesting because sooner or later some kind of problem does appear, and it can really sort of bite into one. And quite often, this can happen, for example, on a retreat, for example. So, one can be on a retreat, and if you're sitting 9 or 10 hours of meditation, not all in one go, obviously, but throughout the day, it's painful. And if on top of that, you've got other restrictions, like you can't talk and you can't distract yourself with TV or your smartphone or anything, you've got no distractions at all. So both mentally and physically, it is extremely demanding, and it pushes you into a corner. And you can, you can go through a whole sort of gamut of feeling, from highs to low, and back again, as well. And that can also provide a great spur to sort of continuing practice. And it's not just actually in the practice of Buddhism. This also can appear elsewhere. I remember, in fact, a friend, a mutual friend, was Roberta, actually. She's an illustrator, and she illustrated a famous Mahayana sutra called the Lotus Sutra. It took her about 15 years to do it. An act of great dedication. And when she was halfway through it, she was invited to go to the British Library in London, where there was a sort of workshop or conference of people who were illustrating religious works, like doing illuminated manuscripts of the Bible, or, and so on and so forth, from different religions. And she got talking to a woman who's an English woman, but who had undergone a very traditional training in Chinese calligraphy and Chinese brush painting. I don't know whether you've seen some of these. They often draw very simple scenes like mountains or bamboo, or fruit or something, or a bird in a tree. And it's very simply done, very quickly done. And they'll put a little verse, usually a little poem or something like that, and it illustrates some kind of spiritual point or something like that. And she explained to Rebecca. She said she spoke to her and told her how she got into this. She said, well, I developed this interest in Chinese brush painting just thinking, because she said I was an artist already, and I've been trained as a fine artist, and I just thought, oh, this is another string to my bow. It'd be quite nice to have. So I went along to this, and she said, of course, the thing with these sorts of things, whether it's a sort of Chinese art or a Japanese art, is that it becomes, it's not just a hobby, it becomes life-changing. It's about developing you as a person, as well as developing a skill. And so I met the teacher, who was a Chinese lady, and she agreed to take me on. And she said, you must do everything that I tell you, everything I tell you. And she went, yeah, okay. And she said, right. So she got a piece of paper, and she picked up a brush, and she said, the first thing I want you to paint or to draw is a leaf. And you do it like this, and you just 3 lines. It's a straight line, one edge, the other edge. She said, and she just, on the piece of paper, she said, there we go. She drew it. She painted it for her with the brush. She gave her the brush. She said, now you do that. So she painted it on. She looked at it and she said, no, you see that line in the middle there? It's too thick. Do it again. And she got her to do it. And she had to do it, a few dozen times. And then the teacher said, okay, that's okay. What I want you to do, I want you to go away and I want you to practice that every single day for at least 20 minutes, and then come and see me in a month. So she did. So she went away and she did this practice every single day. And she went back to the teacher in a month. And the teacher said, okay, she gave her a brush. She said, draw the leaf. So she drew the leaf. And she said, no, that's not quite right. You see this other line, you hesitate on it. It needs to be smooth, no hesitation at all. And so she got her to do it. She drew another, the teacher did another leaf. She got her to copy. And once she was satisfied, she said, go away, come back in a month, practice 20 minutes a day. She said, for 6 months, this went on. She said, it's only a leaf. Now, remember that she was a fine artist, you know, and she said, I can honestly tell you, I went through every emotion in the book, from highs to despair, thinking, what's going to happen when we get onto the bamboo? I mean, she said, this is going to go on forever and ever. But at the end of 6 months, when she finally did it in front of the teacher said, yes, you can do this now. And then the teacher explained to her, she said, it's not about just drawing a leaf, she said. It's about overcoming yourself. She said, it must be so ingrained in you, this ability to be able to draw and to paint using a brush must be so ingrained and at one in you that if someone wakes you up at 2:30 in the morning from a deep sleep, puts a brush in your hand and says, draw a leaf, you should, even with your eyes closed, be able to execute it perfectly. She said, once you can do that, the rest is just technical. She said, you can draw the bamboo, I can show you how to do those fairly quickly because now you've got it. It's absolutely in the body and it will work every single time. And she said, that's indeed, you know, she said it wasn't quite that straightforward, but it was pretty straightforward. The rest of it, you know, was nothing like that. But she had to get through this crisis. That the teacher manufactured a crisis for her. And out of that, the aspiration to become a good, you know, an excellent painter using Chinese ink and brush, she said, was born. This wasn't a hobby. This was all-consuming, and it has to become that. And that is what the Great Ball of Doubt is, because otherwise it requires us to discover in us great strength. And I remember, you know, when Myokyoni was training in Japan, as I said, she trained as a layperson. And she said, when I went over there, there was a little meditation group of lay Japanese who would come once a month to the temple, and they would, you know, for the day, they would you know, have a one-day meditation retreat. And she said, I was curious as to why they wanted to do this, why they were training in Zen. And she said, all of them said to me, for the strength. And she said, oh, quite disappointed, really. She said, because, you know, I thought they might be there for enlightenment, you know, for what's called satori, or to see into the Buddha nature, something sort of grandiloquent like that. But no one said, oh, for, you know, enlightenment. No, not one of them. All of them said, just for the strength. And she said, it wasn't then, she said, I was fairly green then still. She said, but a few years later, I suddenly realized why that strength is so important. Because when you have that strength, actually, you lose the fear. You don't have fear anymore when you have strength. Because if you know that you can face whatever challenges life is going to bring to you, then what's there to be frightened of, really? It's like the old joke, and the man who goes to see the psychiatrist, and he says to the psychiatrist, he said, what's wrong with you? He said, oh, it's not me. He said, it's everybody else. He said, they're all out to get me. He said, my wife conspires against me, my friends conspire against me, my bosses at work conspire against me. And the psychiatrist says, okay, Mr. Smith. He said, you better come and see me 4 times a week for 10 years, and we'll see what we can do for you. So he goes and sees him 4 nights a week for 10 years. And at the end of it, the psychiatrist says, well, Mr. Smith, I'm delighted to inform you that you are cured from your paranoia, from your persecution complex. Mr. Smith says, what persecution complex? He said, I don't have a persecution complex. He said, mind you, everybody's been treating me a lot better recently. Once that strength is there, then of course, suddenly the fear of life goes. And that is why that strength is so important. That strength comes not only from that deep-rooted faith, obviously, which requires us to embark on the path in the first place, but also from that challenge of that great ball of doubt. Because it's in that great ball of doubt, like Bankei's old man discovered, that in that crisis, in that white hot heat of the crisis, that's where we discovered that the strength was there all the time. And once we know that, then even though that strength may vanish again when everything's okay, we know that it will come when it's needed. And so that provides us with that, as it were, that strength and the loss of the fear. So then, obviously, this third one, great determination, sometimes called great courage, or fierce determination, or great courage, perhaps then leads quite naturally out of it. That is that great strength that has now appeared. And and sometimes that strength doesn't even necessarily have to be wielded. It's enough that it just appears. There's a rather nice story of a man who has fashioned a jewel, right, which is very precious to him, and he loves it dearly. And he happens to be walking by the sea, and every so often he would, when the sun was out, he would like to take the jewel, and he loved the way that the sun was iridescent, would play on the facets of the jewel. But the thing, and so he would take it out when it was sunny, and he was looking at it, standing by the ocean, admiring it. And unfortunately, in that ocean, there happened to be a dragon. This is China, and the dragons live at the bottom of rivers, ponds, and oceans. And dragons, of course, they also like jewels as well. And the dragon saw the glinting of the jewel in the sunlight. I thought, I'll have that. So he sort of swam up from the depths, leapt out of the water, grabbed the jewel out of the hand of the man, and dove back in to the water and swam down to his palace, which lived on the seabed. And the man was absolutely bereft, and he couldn't believe it. When he sort of came to himself once more, he shouted out to the dragon, "Bring my jewel back." He said, "You must bring that back to me now, otherwise I shall come in and get it from you." And the dragon laughed and said, "You can't come into this ocean and come down to my palace. You're only a little man." And the man shouted out, he said, "I'm going to get a bucket and I'm going to empty this ocean. And then I shall come in and claim my jewel from your palace, which will stand in a dusty desert, and you'll have no more kingdom." And the dragon laughed and said, "Well, you only have the lifespan of a man. You could spend the rest of your life emptying out this sea, and you would, in your lifetime, you would never manage it." But the man shouted out again and said, this is in a Buddhist context, he said, "Well," he said, "then I take a vow here and now that I will be reborn. And at some point in the future, I will again be reborn as a man. When I am reborn as a human, I will come along with my bucket and I will continue this job. And if I don't finish it in that life, I will be reborn again and I will come back with my bucket and I will continue in every incarnation until I have emptied this ocean out, and I will come in and claim my jewel. And your palace will be rubble, standing in a desert, and you will have lost your kingdom." Now, dragons live for a very long time, and dragon could hear in the voice of that man that vow and knew that he meant every single word of it. And he knew in his heart that at some point in the future, indeed, this man would accomplish what he was vowing to set out to do. And fear arose in the heart of the dragon. And so he swam up to the surface, jumped up, spat the jewel out at the feet of the man, and dove back down to his palace. And the man picked it up, put it back in his pocket, and went on his way. It's rather a nice story, but there is something about that. There is something about that, and possibly, there have been times when we've experienced something and we've not been sure, we've been frightened or in two minds, and then something happens and everything gels together, and it becomes everything. It becomes the absolute surety. This is that third. This is that third quality, that great courage, because in that actually we're quite prepared to do that. And it's rather interesting as well, because we ask, where does that strength come from? And again, Kieran will finish with this. I remember she was saying that it was a Japanese priest that explained it to her. And he said, imagine, he said, the traditional stereotype of the old Japanese granny. She said, they're always very small, they're beanpole thin, and they're bent over like this after a lifetime of very hard work. And she rules the house. And she lives in a very traditional Japanese house, which is basically wood and paper. And she's in on her own when suddenly the house catches fire, because they're a complete fire hazard. And she manages to get herself out before the fire really burns the whole place down. And she manages to pull out the one thing that matters in any traditional household. It's the big wooden chest that contains the family heirlooms. And she manages to drag that out by herself. And in the following morning, the grey light of dawn, it takes two large burly men to pick up that very heavy chest and carry it on. That little bent over, thin, old Japanese granny was able to pull out of bed, that she now would not be able to move. Where does that strength come from? Where does that strength come from? So this is why the training does throw up challenges, but it allows us the opportunity, as it were, to discover the strength in ourselves to be able to face them. And with that, then the faith in that energy, in that power, can be established. Okay, I'm going to leave that there because I think I've spoken for long enough. So I think what we'll just have maybe 5 minutes or so, just quiet sitting, and then if anyone has any questions, we'll take them. We won't need a bell on this. So we'll open it up if the floor's open for any questions. If anybody has any questions online, you can just unmute.
Martin,
yes.
I just basically wanted to ask you about how sometimes we're triggered by something. So I'll run to most of part of the banter we have is to protect the mick out of whatever. And nearly all the time it's good natured. We've kind of insult one another in a gentle sort of way. And I think sometime last year, my wife phoned up my brother, who lives in the east side of Yorkshire. She wanted to talk to his wife. My brother Dennis answered the phone. Christine said to him something like, "Oh," she said, "I wanted to speak to the organ grinder, not the monkey. Would you put me on to Maureen?" And my brother, he said, "That's very insulting," and he slammed the phone down. Well, I do love my brother, so phone back, and he was very, very upset. It's a joke, it's just a turn of phrase. And so it turned out, he was the village slaughterman, the village rule. And his boss was very bullying man. He used to diminish him by put him in the monk care.
No.
Then eventually he sacked him. Hard work. He went to work for another butcher in a neighbouring village. And this guy had sacked him, and I never understood why. He went back, and he offered him more money to go back. I think overall, Dennis worked with maybe nearly 40 years.
Right.
He wasn't treated well, and I couldn't really understand why he stayed there. So what my wife had said was just said in jest.
Yeah.
But it triggered this
Yeah.
thing, which seems to be a little bit like, you know, laying
Yeah.
cell.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean that's a very good example. And when we begin this training, I mean, when we begin, an important aspect of it, which I only really touched on, is this. But in the talks that I've given here, I've mentioned what's called working with the fires, which is working with the three fires, or I think in Tibetan Buddhism they're called three poisons of greed, hatred, and ignorance or delusion. And that's just a shorthand way of really just talking about these emotional reactions that we have. And the reason that that's important is that the energy that is caught up in these emotional reactions is the same energy that's in the wisdom and the warmth of heart and the compassion that we hear about in Buddhism. But it needs to be freed from the passions in order to grow the wisdom and grow the compassion, the actual warmth of heart. And, we all have that in us. We all have a certain amount of wisdom in us, and we all have a certain amount of, compassion and warmth of heart. But it tends to be very partial. So, I'm prepared to be compassionate, but just to those people I think really deserve, in that sort of way. Obviously, the Buddha's compassion is universal. So, it's not more for one and less for the other, depending on what I think about you. It's universal in that way. So that's the ideal. That is the actual ideal. But the thing is that, as I said, that energy of the fires is what goes to make up that bundle that we call the attachment to self, the craving. The attachment, like the old lady who was attached to the idea that she was rubbish. And she was very vocal and forceful. Not very much, she was very forceful about it as well. That was a very deep attachment. Now, obviously, that will go back a long way, like with your brother. There will be a history to that because there always is. So when we begin working with these fires, we can't work with those big ones because they're too big. To say to your brother, like say he was a Buddhist, to say you should be working with the fires is only going to trigger him even more, and understandably. So what we do is we start with the little fires. We start with the little annoyances, the little things that we can cope with. Those irritations that really just sort of fly out very quick. So you're driving in the car and someone pulls out in front and go. So we learn to hold that. We learn to, as it were, open up and bear the physical side of the energetic side of the reaction without allowing it to go into either a or even into the thoughts, because that's the other thing. If it can't be released through an action or through a speech, then quite often the energy gets squeezed and it goes up and it goes brrr, and it goes round and round, and you spend a whole morning being annoyed with everyone and everything, until it burns itself out and it's all passion spent. So even that's quite a powerful, that's quite a powerful. So to really restrain, to really be able to hold it, is quite. So that's why we have to start with those smaller passions. But the thing is, and this is where, if you want to talk in terms of karma, this is Buddhism, so we obviously do talk in terms of karma. Is sort of, one way of looking at karma is to see it as, or one aspect is to see it as laying down these psychological traits from the past that re-emerge or become evoked into the present when they meet the right conditions. So in that case, you know, your brother, that term monkey that he had been called for many, many, many years, you know, most of the time it just disappears. You don't, you know, your wife didn't see it. And then suddenly, you know, unfortunately, she happened to be one of the conditions that suddenly, you know, triggered it. And suddenly that anger surges up again, that may have been laid dormant even for quite a while. And we would call that's in that moment, he was reborn as a fighting demon. He was ready to go out and fight for his, you know, for his status again, which is what, you know, because that being called a monkey like that was demeaning to him.
But I'm just wondering if there's any way I could help him with that.
Well, probably, actually, yes. I mean, if that sort of thing plagues it, I mean, there's a sort of, as I say, it's exactly the same advice that Miyake gave to that person who was upset, you know, and it's the advice that I give also. It's that if you find that something like that, so if you do get triggered with something like that, particularly if you end up with, you know, that thing going round and round, and you know it's going to be there for half a day, you know, it can happen sort of like, you know, if you get woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning, you know, the car alarm's going off or something like that, and you think, it's happened again, that neighbor, and, you know, he doesn't care about the fact that I've got to be up early tomorrow, you know, causing that noise like that, and then 2 hours later, you're still lying there fuming now, and now it's everyone at work who doesn't appreciate you and all that sort of thing as well. And it's become a whole sort of thing. Rather than stewing in all those thoughts, move, get out of bed and do those 9 bows and then go back to bed. Because once we get that into the body, once we come back into the body a little bit more, then it's not feeding the thoughts, because that energy will feed the thoughts, and the thoughts will keep triggering that energy to actually arise. So it's breaking that cycle. It's breaking that cycle, this feedback loop that you end with.
I just wondered, would it be possible to substitute the vows by reciting a mantra instead?
Yes, he could.
Would that work?
Yes, he could do, but it probably, I would probably suggest, rather than maybe a man. I mean, does he practice? Is he?
No.
Okay. Well, then in that case, I would suggest that he doesn't use a Sanskrit or Tibetan or Chinese mantra. He should, if he wants to, he should use something that is meaningful to him, that, as it were, reminds him that life is bigger than just this incident.
Yes.
Because what happens when we get triggered? See, what happens when we become, say, angry, or when we really want something? If I really want something, everything else disappears. It's just that wanting. Nothing else matters to me. And so I become locked in. I literally become entranced. And actually, people who are in a powerful emotional state are in trances because they're fixated. If you've ever spoken to one of your friends has become upset and starts talking to you about it, have you noticed how they just repeat the same thing again and again and again? They're locked in. They're completely locked in. That's what I mean. They're in a trance. A trance is a narrowing of consciousness, just focused on the object of desire or the object of hate, or the object of anxiety is another one. If you've heard, people, I'm sure we all know someone who has a sort of anxious temperament, and they just talk about this one thing again and again and again and again. It just goes round and round, and they can become really locked in it. And it's only if you manage to sort of interject something in that knocks them out of it, that suddenly then the emotion changes, and they'll laugh, or they'll suddenly, be able to see things slightly differently. So I would suggest that he should have some, and I don't know. I mean, it could be a piece of poetry. It could be a saying that sort of speaks to them. Like a classic one. I mean, actually, the only one that comes to mind is it actually comes from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. There's a phrase, I can't remember, is it Exodus? I can't remember. Anyway, there's a phrase that says, "Be still and know that I am God." Be still and know that I am God. And the reason that I mention that is that I know people who use that. It just works for them. Now, it's not going to work for everybody in the same way, because we have different feelings and temperaments. But there might be something else that you can use, and you can use that like a mantra. It reframes the whole thing. It suddenly reminds that the world isn't just about this fallout that I've had with Bob, and that now is right at the forefront of my mind. To suddenly remember that at the end of the day, what's the point in holding a grudge? We're all going to die. We're all impermanent. We're going to go to the grave. Still thinking this is the most important thing. It just reframes it for you in that way. But yeah, you just need to find something.
Okay.
Or he needs to find something.
Yeah.
And actually, just a last point on that. If he makes the effort to go and do that, the fact that he's making the effort to find something that's using will in itself help cut that all down to size a little bit more, because he wants to help himself. And that also gives strength as well, when we suddenly decide not exactly necessarily to take control, but to take charge of one's own emotions and behavior, reactions, etc.
What's quite interesting, there's been a lot of big moments. So that you were smoking from before, big moment, for example, it's always like big moments, you think sort of jumps in his faith, or is it sometimes more gradual affair? Would you say that the big moments are kind of, some people have them, or you think?
It's,
you see what I mean?
yes, I do. Those big moments can be slightly beguiling, because we tend to, rather like Goethe with the finger, we forget the 10 years before. We just see that one thing because it's very visible, it's very noticeable, and the transformation is instant. And in a way, it is like that. But what you can get is that you can get lots of very small aha moments that build up over a period of time. And then you look back and you realize that a significant transformation has actually taken place. So it's not necessarily that, you see the morning star and suddenly you're awakened and, it's Buddhahood now. But you can, over a period maybe of a year or 2 years, you suddenly look back and realize that something was a problem is no longer a problem. That realization comes in a moment. But the build up to it can take quite a long time as well. And as I say, quite often what you have, Master Hakuin talked about this, who was another very famous Japanese Zen master. And he said that he had had many big awakenings, but many, many hundreds of very small ones as well. And I would have to say, in my own experience, that you do get lots of those sort of quite small, and they can come up and they can be forgotten as well. And then you have to re-experience them again because you did forget about them. That can happen, for example, on retreats, because retreats are a period of intensive practice. Quite often, there will be moments when something will suddenly shine through and crystallize. And, a number of times I've been back on a retreat and thought, I've been here before, but I'd completely forgotten about it. It had vanished because I'd never, because the one thing that you have to do with an insight when it appears is that you have to work at it to keep it conscious, which means somehow putting it into practice. It has to mean something. It's not just a case that You know, the Buddha looked up, saw the morning star, and said, "Wow, I've just seen into the Buddha nature," and then just carried on. You know, not it had no effect. True insight, and this is what I would always say, that genuine insight is always transformative. It changes your life, often in a very small way, but in a significant way. And that's what beds it in.
Touch set, obviously, builds up as you go, experiences, more hang-ups. I'm thinking more and more when I meditate, thinking go to not necessarily day to day, but how do I go back and deconstruct and come to terms with hang-ups and things in the past? That's something you actually go to and try. So I'm not talking about sort of big horrific.
No.
Personally, to me,
Yeah.
you live and you have hang-ups from your youth and
Yeah.
upbringing and things. You go and try and actively.
Okay. So some of them will, some of them will, some of them won't, and that we have to accept. But what can change is your attitude towards them. So, for example, you know, if for example that you recognise that you have a bit of a hot temper, and you can learn to change, you can learn to accept it. And okay, you can begin by thinking that this is a terrible thing to have a terrible temper. And the one thing that you're basically doing is feeding it. By pushing something away like that, it tends to trigger it, even more. But what you can do is you can begin to change your relationship to some of these things. So for example, I've got a friend of mine who suffers from manic depression, clinical manic depression, over a period of time, as she's, when it first started, it was overwhelming, but it's happened so many times now that she knows she'll get through it, even though it's very bleak. She knows she will get through it, and knowing that comes back to that faith thing. Knowing that helps her cope. It hasn't made it go away, and she'll have it till the day she dies. And she knows that, and she accepts that. But for a long time, she lived with this, if you like, a vain hope, I suppose, in some ways, that she could overcome, that she thought she could overcome it with meditation, all this. And then it didn't work, and she got very despondent about meditation. I said, well, okay, maybe you need to change how you're thinking about, how you're actually thinking about it. And that provided her with a relief, because now she didn't feel responsible when it happened. She could accept that this was part of who and what she was. And that allowed her to change her relationship to these things. As I say, it doesn't take it away, but it does help us cope with those things. So, but again, when it comes to some of the other sort of hang-ups, if you like, again, we start with the small things. And that's fine, because if you're working with those small emotional reactions, it's the same pool of energy as feeds into the big ones. And what happens is that as you develop a bit more of a skill, working with those, being able to hold together with those small reactions, the bigger ones cease to be quite so big and become middling sized. So, because it's the same pool of energy. So they themselves begin to change as you begin to do the work, even with the quite small ones. If that makes sense. Okay. Yes.
So, just back from compassionate mental health in Wales, and the lady there who was one of them, gave us such hope, because actually through the changes of the practices, has no longer.
Wow. Okay.
I do creative therapy.
Right. Right.
See the change.
Yeah. I mean,
So
no, that's fine, because I'm aware of that as well. I mean, although I don't work in that field, obviously I've read some of the literature because I'm interested. But the interesting thing is that I'm also aware that, for example, like this friend of mine, she has tried everything, and she's tried every medication as well, and she's tried lots of different forms of therapy, and it just seems to be very ingrained. You know, it hasn't shifted it. Much to her chagrin, she would, you know, obviously she would love it too. But so and so I say that, you know, simply because I know that sometimes it can exacerbate people's mental health if they feel that they not only suffer from depression, they feel that they've failed, you know, as a result of suffering from it. And that's a terrible thing to sort of put on someone's shoulders when they're already, you know, suffering from that, which I'm sure you know about. But yes, no, thank you. Yes, there is. And actually, even, you know, even for her, she sees that. She sees that even with her condition, you know, life is worth living, and you know, she can face. There are problems that come up. I mean, my goodness, she's been having to deal with, you know, all the benefits and things like that, and you know, sometimes that can be very difficult for her as well. Particularly if a letter, you know, she gets a letter from the welfare department, and it can frighten her, and you know, all that, and it happens to hit her on at a bad time, you know, all that. But she knows that even if that happens, that doesn't frighten her as much, and she's also got a pretty good network of people, and that gives her a great deal of strength as well, of course. Yeah.
Can I just ask something? You're suggesting you do a form of insight meditation. You're working through your issues on small. I've never, I don't even like to use the word progressive to insight, but I simply do calm abiding.
Yeah.
That's the extent of my practice. And one gets insight, you know, one gets in little moments. I'm just wondering, do you see a difference between the two, or should you be looking at one or the other? I mean, I'm just wondering your sort of attitude or views towards the practice.
Well, I mean, any Buddhist practice really is made up of sort of three strands. One is a meditation practice, one is the ethical practice, and the other is the wisdom practice as well. And the wisdom practice can, you know, take the form of, you know, reading about the Dharma, hearing Dharma talks, you know, regular association with coming into contact with the Dharma, that sort of thing as well. And it's, you know, if a Buddhist practice has those three in whatever form, then I think you can honestly say that you are undertaking a Buddhist practice. If you're just doing one of those, then you're just doing one of those. I mean, that's you know, your mileage may vary, I don't know, but that's sort of, that's how I measure it, really. And, you know, because the Buddha, you know, in the Noble Eightfold Path, you know, you can split the Noble Eightfold Path into those three. It's the Shila practice, the discipline, daily life practice, the ethical practice, meditation practice, and wisdom practice. So really, you know, as I say, the feeling is that somehow those three form, as it were, the tripod on which everything else, you know, sort of depends. So, you know, if you're coming into contact with the Dharma, and you are, obviously, you're practicing meditation, and, you know, we follow the precepts at the very least, maybe even a little bit more, then that's a Buddhist practice, you know. And it will affect change, because Buddhist practice is about transforming the heart. It's about learning to let go, you know, of those strong self-beliefs that we all have, and learn to see, you know, the world in a bigger way, a more open way. I don't know if that answers your question.
No,
That's how I sort of measure a Buddhist practice, if you like. We're coming up to 9 o'clock. I think we'll probably.
So is there anybody else?
Sorry, did you?
No, just to say thank you.
My pleasure. All right, we'll call it that. Did you want to just dedicate?
Once again, I wish to thank you for making this effort. Bringing up here.
Pleasure.
we think at least 10 years of this effort.
Yeah.
Yeah. 3 or 4 times a year. And much appreciated. We can have some refreshments if you want.
Did you want to just do the dedication, turning over the map?
Do the dedication of members,
Thank
which is at the bottom of the sheet that you have there. May whatever benefit arises from this practice go to the benefit of all sentient beings, stirred by the waves of birth, sickness, aging, and death. May they be free from the oceans of samsara. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and we'll say goodbye to everybody online as well. All the best. Bye bye. I'm going to switch off then. Okay.